Hello everyone, and welcome back to my Magic the Gathering Commander deck list review. After spending some time looking around at different commanders, I finally stumbled upon one that I thought had a very unique and widespread ability. That commander is Yarok the Desecrated. Yarok is an elemental horror that costs 2 colorless, a black, a green, and a blue. It has Death Touch, Lifelink, and says, if a permanent entering the battlefield causes the triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This means that any effects of any permanents you control, whether that be lands, creatures, enchantments, or what have you, if they have some sort of trigger that affects either them coming onto the battlefield or any other card coming onto the battlefield, then that ability triggers an additional time. Because of how widespread this ability is, there are a lot of different ways to build Yarok, and the one I went with was Landfall. But before I get into the deck review, I would like to talk about Yarok's power level. At a scale from 1 to 10, I would put Yarok at about an 8. Because of Yarok's colors, which are widely regarded to be the most powerful 3 colors, as well as his very widespread ability that has many uses, I think that there are enough powerful synergies to put him at the cEDH level. One thing I want to make clear is this rating is not for the deck that I have made, but for the commander itself. I believe the commander's value in general is much more pertinent than the specific way that I built around it. For this reason, I opt to use this scale for the commander and not the deck that I've made. So don't take this deck as being competitive because it is not. I just believe that the commander itself can be used in a competitive nature. Now without further ado, let's get into the deck review. Firstly, I'm going to go over what I would consider the powerhouse cards. These are cards that, when drawn and played under the correct conditions, will change the game drastically and most likely result in a win. Though because Yarok has such a widespread amount of cards he can use because of his ability, there are quite a few categories I'm going to be putting these cards into. These categories are landfall triggers, extra land drops, and general ETB triggers. One major component of Magic is playing lands so you can cast bigger and bigger spells as turns progress. A landfall ability is an ability that triggers whenever a land enters the battlefield. But because of the specific wording, this means that Yarok makes these landfall triggers trigger twice. Some of the most prudent landfall cards are Lotus Cobra, Obnixilis the Fallen, Skewed Swarm, Ruin Crab, Nissa of Shadowed Boughs, Royal Elemental, and Tatyova Benthic Druid. These aren't the only landfall cards in the deck, far from it actually, but these all denote very different effects for the landfall trigger. First we have Lotus Cobra, which is a snake that costs 1 colorless and 1 green. It says, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. This falls into the category of a ramp landfall trigger, because whenever we put a land down, which normally would give us mana, we get bonus mana for doing so. And in the event that we have Yarok on the battlefield, we get 2 extra mana of any color we choose instead of just 1, as well as whatever land we put down if it is untapped, for around a net average of 3 mana each time we put down a land. This can be huge in generating mana, especially when you get to the point where you have multiple lands you can place down per turn. Another card very much like Lotus Cobra is Tireless Provisioner. It also has landfall trigger, but instead of creating 1 mana of any color, it creates a food or a treasure token. This in a way can be better than Lotus Cobra, because the mana that you get from the treasures are permanent. And if need be, you could filter some of those landfall triggers into food if you are low on life. Next up, we have Obnixilis the Fallen. Obnixilis is a demon that costs 3 colorless and 2 black. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have a target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3 +1/+1 counters on Obnixilis the Fallen. This is one of the more devastating landfall triggers, since every time you place a land down, you are dealing direct damage to someone's life. This sort of life loss is highly evasive, as it cannot be blocked by creatures and cannot be countered with your usual counterspell. Not only that, but the landfall trigger also pumps Obnixilis a bit, giving him 3 more power and toughness for every land you put down. And again, with Yarok out, this becomes even more devastating. Losing 6 life and being able to put 6 +1/+1 counters on just for placing a land down is a very efficient way of dealing damage. Next up, we have one of the most infamous landfall cards in the entire game, and that's Skewed Swarm. Skewed Swarm is an insect that costs 2 colorless and a green and reads, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that is a copy of Skewed Swarm instead. To most people, the amount of value this card has isn't readily apparent since you're only creating 1/1 tokens on your land drops. However, it is that second landfall trigger that really matters. Instead of creating just another 1/1 insect, you create a copy of Skewed Swarm, which has the same landfall ability. Meaning that every time you play a land after you have 6 lands on the battlefield, you are multiplying the amount of Skewed Swarms you have exponentially. Let's say you have 5 lands on the battlefield and you place your 6th. With Skewed Swarm and Yarok out, you will be creating 2 more Skewed Swarm copies. This means that the 7 landfall trigger will trigger each of those twice, creating 6 more Skewed Swarms. At this point, you have 9 Skewed Swarms, and on the 8th landfall, you will have 27. Now you might be able to see how this ability can get out of hand as you are tripling the amount of Skewed Swarms you have with every single land drop. There have been times in games where I've gotten thousands upon thousands of Skewed Swarms just because I've gotten 4 or 5 land drops in a turn. And paired with some of the other cards in this deck, you may end up with even more. Next up is one of the more ruthless cards, and that is Ruin Crab. Ruin Crab is a crab that costs 1 blue and has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills 3 cards. But with Yarok out, each player is actually milling 6. And this is not just one player, this is all 3 of your opponents. This means that each landfall trigger with Yarok out would mill your opponents a total of 18 cards. While this deck is nowhere near centered around mill, to only have to pay 1 blue mana to devastate your opponent's card pool is extremely worthwhile. All around, Ruin Crab is just a great card for a very low cost. Next is Nissa of Shadowed Boughs, who's a planeswalker that costs 2 colorless, a black, and a green. She starts with 4 loyalty and has the passive ability of landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa of Shadowed Boughs. Her +1 says, untap target land you control. You may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace until end of turn. It's still a land. And lastly, her -5 ability reads, you may put a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control onto the battlefield from your hand or graveyard with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. While its abilities are extremely nice, the biggest part of this card is its landfall trigger. Being able to passively put loyalty counters on it without actually having to use a loyalty ability for that turn is huge. Also, being able to play cards from your hand is good enough on its own, but being able to reanimate from your graveyard is just that much better. Once this comes onto the battlefield, players will definitely find it to be a nuisance, as its ability allows you to cheat in way bigger creatures than normally would be possible. Even though players may begin to target her, you can just place down lands in response to buffer enough to take the hits. Or you might use her downtick ability to bring out something like Decklist to have a large blocker to defend her. Next up, we have the powerhouse that is Royal Elemental. Royal Elemental is an elemental that costs 3 colorless and 3 blue. It has flying and landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may gain control of target creature for as long as you control Royal Elemental. This card, while costing a lot of mana to cast, more than makes up for it with its ability. Being able to steal someone's creatures just by playing a land is insane, especially when you have Yarok out and you get a 2-for-1 on your land drops. This card can very much change the tides of a battle, as you can steal key pieces to an enemy's board state. It may also be used as a bargaining chip, since many players will be swayed with their precious creatures on the line. And last but not least, we have Tatyova Benthic Druid. Tatyova is a merfolk druid that costs 3 colorless, a green, and a blue. It says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This falls under another category of landfall triggers, which is card advantage. Being able to play lands and not only get extra mana, but also life and extra cards is huge. With Yarok out, every landfall trigger will net you 2 extra life and 2 extra cards in your hand. While card draw is great on its own, these draw landfall triggers can start up some engines that we'll talk about later in the deck. And now we are coming to our second category, which is land drops. And this is not just extra lands each turn, but also affecting what are lands and where they can be played from. The cards I'm going to be talking about in this category are Azusa Lost But Seeking, Oracle of Moldiah, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Aesi, Tyrant of the Gyre Strait, Panharmonicon, Ancient Greenwarden, and Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. While there are other cards in this deck that pertain to this category, they are mostly your run-of-the-mill ramp spells. And so, for the sake of a deck review, I decided to stick with these main 7 cards. Azusa is a human monk that costs 2 colorless and a green, and reads, you may play 2 additional lands on each of your turns. Now, most other creatures that give extra land drops only give 1. Azusa is the only card, to my knowledge, that actually gives a player 2 extra land drops for a single card. Not only that, but it only costs 3 mana, which is awesome for ramping early on in the game. Oracle of Moldiah is an elf shaman that costs 3 colorless and a green and reads, you may play an additional land on each of your turns, play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play lands from the top of your library. Not only does this card give you an additional land drop, but also card advantage, allowing you to look at the top of your library and also cast lands from it if you did not have it in your hand. Being able to look at the top card of your library is very nice, especially when you have any sort of draw spell. That way, you will know exactly what you're getting, at least somewhat, when you cast the spell. Dryad of the Ancient Grove is a nymph that costs 2 colorless and a green. It says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. This is another card that seems to have a fairly useless ability, but becomes a lot clearer when you know the exact wording and rules of Magic. When a land is considered one of the basic land types, that means that they can tap for the color of whatever land that is. In essence, Dryad of the Ancient Grove allows you to tap any of your land for any color. This card is extremely useful in multicolored decks because it fixes your mana, allowing you to tap any of your lands, basic or non-basic, for whatever color you want, on top of also giving you that extra land drop, which is highly effective in a Yarok deck. Aesi, Tyrant of Gyre Strait is a serpent that costs 4 colorless, a green, and a blue. It says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Aesi is sort of in between the 2 card types I've listed, but I felt to put it in this pile more than the other because having an extra land drop usually is more important than having an extra landfall trigger. That being said, a card that not only gives you an extra land drop, but also gives you a reward for playing more lands is great. But because of this, it does suffer from a fairly high mana cost, though the 6 mana is often worth investing for the abilities Aesi has. Panharmonicon is an artifact for 4 colorless that reads, if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. This is sort of like another Yarok, except it only applies to artifacts and creatures. Though with creatures and artifacts that have their own ETBs, this card can matter a lot, and I'll get to those later on in the video. Ancient Greenwarden is an elemental that costs 4 colorless and 2 green. It has reach and says you may play lands from your graveyard, and if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And in a lot of ways, this card matters a lot more than Panharmonicon because our deck is more based around lands, and being able to play lands from our graveyard is also a nice bonus. Ancient Greenwarden is also a fairly beefy card on its own, having not only reach to catch those flyers, but being a 5/7. If you were able to get Ancient Greenwarden or Panharmonicon along with Yarok out, you can have a crazy amount of triggers all from 1 or 2 cards. To end off this part of the list, I would like to talk about one of the most important cards in this deck, and that is Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. Ashaya is an elemental for 3 colorless and 2 green that says, Ashaya, Soul of the Wild's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. And most importantly, non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. This card is crazy overpowered when paired with Yarok, because all of your non-token creatures are forests. That means they count as lands when they come into the battlefield and will trigger landfall. With this card out, Ancient Greenwarden also now applies to all of your creatures, meaning that with the 4 of these cards out, Yarok, Ashaya, Panharmonicon, and Greenwarden, a creature entering the battlefield will trigger a landfall 4 times. And that's not even the best part, because, like what we talked about with Dryad of the Ancient Grove, all of your creatures are now basic forests. That means that all of your creatures can now tap for a green in addition to all of their other abilities. The amount of value this card holds is incredible. It can completely change the outcome of a game because now all of your landfall triggers are 4 times more potent than they were before. Because of Ashaya's first ability, this also means that Ashaya will become ridiculously strong in a short amount of time. Because not only do your regular lands count towards her power, but all of your creatures that are not tokens also do. Even if you had 6 lands out and 7 creatures, she is a 13/13 on her own. And more often than not, she will be even bigger. And the last card type I'd like to talk about are the regular ETB triggers. These include, but are not limited to, Wood Elves, Kodama of the East Tree, Avenger of Zendikar, and Cultivator Colossus. Wood Elves is an elf scout that costs 2 colorless and a green and says, when Wood Elves enters the battlefield, search your library for a forest card, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. While there are other creatures that have very similar abilities, like Farhaven Elf and Solemn Simulacrum, Wood Elves is by far the best because of the specific card text. Nowhere in its text does it say you have to look for a basic forest card, which means anything from the shock lands to the original dual lands can be tutored for. Not only that, but it does not say that this land comes in tapped, which means even if you look for a basic forest, that is again free mana you can just put onto your battlefield and use immediately. This card becomes even better with Yarok on the battlefield because it triggers not once, but twice. You look through your library for 2 forest cards, put them both on the battlefield, and get 2 whole landfall triggers. For only 3 mana, this is a highly effective ramp card that should be put in any Yarok deck that can run it. Kodama is a spear that costs 4 colorless and 2 green. It has reach, partner, and whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. What this means is that whenever we put any sort of permanent on the battlefield, whether that be a creature, an enchantment, artifact, or a land, we can put out another permanent from our hand for free that has equal to or lesser converted mana cost. This means that with Yarok out, every land drop will allow you to put 2 more lands from your hand onto the battlefield for free. And of course, when you put out anything other than a land, you can cheat out 2 things just as big. This means you could play something as big as Blightsteel Colossus and put down 2 more things that are just as big for free. Avenger of Zendikar is an elemental that costs 5 colorless and 2 green. It says, whenever Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control. And Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. This is similar to Skewsworm's ability, except the amount of creatures you have only comes from 1 landfall trigger. But with Yarok on the battlefield as well, every time you put a land down, each of those plants get 2 +1/+1 counters. Let's say you had 7 lands and you played Avenger of Zendikar. This means that you would get 7 0/1 plant tokens, but each time you put another land down, they would be buffed by 2 power and 2 toughness. And if you have some way to recast Avenger of Zendikar, you can make even more plant tokens. Besides Skewsworm, Avenger of Zendikar is the best way to build a big army and build it fast. Cultivator Colossus is a plant beast that costs 4 colorless and 3 green. It has trample and says, Cultivator Colossus' power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. And whenever Cultivator Colossus enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. In essence, Cultivator Colossus is a landfall engine. On its ETB, you are given the chance to put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. And if you are able to do so, you're able to draw a card and do the whole process over again. Because of the cyclical nature of Cultivator Colossus, it can be paired with cards like Tatyova and Ruin Crab to win you the game. Let's say you had Yarok, Tatyova, and Ruin Crab on your battlefield and you played Cultivator Colossus. Off of Cultivator Colossus' ETB, if you did have a land in your hand and played it, you would get a multitude of landfall triggers. First, you would gain 2 life, draw 2 extra cards, draw 1 card off of Cultivator Colossus, and mill an opponent for 6. Hopefully within those 3 cards you drew, or within your hand already, you'd have another land and be able to repeat the process. And this is only with these 4 cards on the battlefield. If you had something like Obnixilis or Skewsworm also down, it would assuredly be a game over for your opponents. Out of all the cards in Crimson Vow, Cultivator Colossus is definitely my favorite. And now that we've gone over the most vital cards in the deck, I want to talk about some of the honorable mentions. These are cards that are not necessary for the deck's main purpose, but provide additional value and synergize with the cards I talked about earlier. The first card I want to talk about is fairly obscure, but also fairly valuable. And that card is Concordant Crossroads. Concordant Crossroads is an enchantment that costs 1 green and says, all creatures have haste. This means not only your creatures have haste, but so do your opponents. Though, as long as it's your turn, this should not matter too much, and that's usually when you want to play this card. Concordant Crossroads is meant to be a finisher, as it will speed up the process of being able to attack with any new tokens you may have summoned from something like Skewsworm or Avenger of Zendikar. Normally you'd have to wait a turn for all of your creatures to get over their summoning sickness, but not with Concordant Crossroads out. Without this card in the deck, I've had many instances where I can build up a big army with Yarok, but because all of those creatures I just summoned this turn, I can't attack with them, but now that I have all these creatures, all of my opponents target me and I am killed before I get to use any of them. This card ensures that all of your creatures will be able to attack right away and give a speedy death to all of your opponents. The last type of cards in this deck I want to touch on before we get to upgrades are fetch lands. And I don't just mean the expensive ones like Polluted Delta, but any land that you sacrifice to tutor up another land. Normally, cards like Fabled Passage, Terramorphic Expanse, and Evolving Wilds only have so much use in other decks and are often taken out for better lands, but in this deck, they have worth all the way up to competitive. Because 2 lands are technically entering the battlefield, you are getting 2 different landfalls with each of these cards. Let's say you play an Evolving Wilds as your land for turn. This itself will trigger landfall, but you can then crack Evolving Wilds and search up any sort of basic land, put that onto the battlefield, and get an additional landfall trigger. In essence, you are getting quadruple the value for each of your land drops if you also have Yarok on the battlefield. Let's take Lotus Cobra for example. With Yarok and Lotus Cobra on the field, we can play Evolving Wilds to net ourselves 2 mana of any color. We can then crack that Evolving Wilds and get 2 more mana. And if you do play something like the fetch lands, or in Fabled Passage's case, have 4 or more lands on your battlefield already, there's a potential to net even more mana. Now that we're finally done with looking at all the amazing cards in this deck, let's talk about upgrades. In all honesty, there aren't really a lot of cards outside of lands that you could really add to this deck. The only 2 creatures I might recommend putting in this deck are Augur of Autumn and the Gitrog monster. As for other non-land cards, you could add any of the obligatory counterspells or tutors, like Demonic Tutor or Force of Will, since we are in black and blue. Though if anything, I would recommend just upgrading the mana base. Like I said earlier, one of the more important aspects of this deck are actually fetch lands. Any of the fetch lands, like Misty Rainforest or Flooded Strand, would be a lot more useful in this deck because of the extra landfall triggers. Also, anything with the basic land type because those lands can be tutored for. You might add in some of the shock lands like Overgrown Tomb or Breeding Pool, and if you're looking to get real spendy, you could go for something like the original duels, like a Tropical Island or an Underground Sea. Though besides that, this deck is fairly optimized for what it wants to do, and really does not need to be upgraded any further for the average player. Though I do include this segment in the video just in case you are that player that wants to go above and beyond. And now, with the upgrades out of the way, I would like to come to my final thoughts on this deck. Originally, I never really planned on building Yarok. The deck that was sort of its predecessor was actually a Terragrid God of Fright deck. Though if you know anything about Terragrid and the way players have reacted to it, it was looking to get banned in the near future. Because of this, I decided to break apart my Terragrid deck and look for another black commander that I could pour all of these cards into. I looked at a few mono black commanders, but none of them really fit my tastes. I always seemed to be wanting something from another color that just was not possible in mono black. Then I started looking at dual color decks. I knew the deck was going to be centered around black, but it was hard to choose a secondary color to complement it. Dimir was the first color combination that came to mind, but all of the commanders just didn't really fit the bill for what I was looking for. It was a lot of mill and reanimation, which just wasn't what I wanted to play. Golgari was another color combination that also caught my eye, but again, it lacked some of the parts that the other colors had. And that's when I finally started looking at 3 color commanders. At this point, there weren't a whole lot of commanders to choose from, but the narrower selection helped with my indecisiveness. After looking at my favorites from the 2 color commanders, I realized that the colors I wanted to draw from most were both blue and green. Because of this, I decided to go with the Sultai commander like Yarok. There are quite a few good commanders within the Sultai color range, but Yarok stood above them all. Just the sheer amount of deck archetypes that his ability allowed for was what made me pick him to be my next commander. I'd always thought landfall was a pretty unique mechanic and had some pretty strong cards attached to it, but Yarok made it all the better since I could incorporate some other ETB effects outside of lands. After I'd gotten it to the level that it's at now, I do have to say this has become one of my favorite decks to play. Although this deck can do many powerful things, it is still well below cEDH, making it a great pick for casual games at my local game store. Having gone on and on about this commander for a while now, I'd like to now hear your thoughts. What did you think of this deck review? Do you perhaps find Yarok to be a commander worth checking out? Or maybe you want to see some other commanders reviewed? Make sure to put your feedback in the comments below, because I do enjoy interacting with you guys, and I love to hear what you have to say. For complete deck list, make sure to check the description below, and I'll see all of you in the next video.